It's 9:05. I know it's early on a Friday for folks, but we are going to get started. I just want to welcome you, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Silby, CLIC's faculty director, to kick us off.
Great. Well, thanks everyone and welcome. I might say some more welcomes before the other panels as other people roll in. As I said, I'm Jessica Silby. I'm the faculty director at the law school for CLIC. I teach in the areas of intellectual property and constitutional law. And although we're really sorry not to be doing this in person, I have some Nusel art behind us, I'll be displaying all the public art on Northeastern campus throughout the day. So we'll get a sense of what the place looks like, but we're really excited to take advantage of the digital platform, which we'll hope we'll be able to engage in some really great conversations around law and technology and democracy on the eve of what is no doubt probably one of the most federal elections of our lives. So to that end, I feel like I just have to say, I hope everyone's voted or prepared to vote or has a plan to vote and is taking someone with them to vote as well. There can't be more urgency in that right now. So that's the first thing I'll say to you all today. And the second thing I'll say is, the digital technologies that we celebrate just haven't actually solved all the problems that we as humans have created. So I think the only thing that's going to preserve the best parts of humanity and the planet are actually the human connections, not the digital devices necessarily. And so that's what we're here to talk about today in these three panels, and the keynote exploring with diverse experts and practitioners how the digital age is affecting health and privacy and the evaluation of truth and information. And our last panel is on art and artistic practices and how they too are central to grounding the digital age and fundamental values. One of the questions we'll be asking in that panel is how art has a role to play in undermining tyranny and preserving democracy. So if you stay for all three panels today and the keynote by amazing Ann Nelson, you may meet many of our faculty members, Brook Baker and Woody Hartzog, Claudia Haupt, Ari Waldman, Patricia Williams, Cara Swanson, and many others. So come for the panels and stay afterwards for the chat. The organizers, Tony Morgan, who I should say has done all of this, thank you, Tony, has organized for us to stay after each panel to chat if we'd like to. And then if people want to move into the next panel, the next Zoom room is for that. So staying after each panel to chit chat like we might do in the hallways has been made available to us. So at the end, at any time during the day, if you need to reach a CLIC organizer, just in the chat, we'll be monitoring the chat. We have about 5 team members doing that. Send it to Tony, send it to me, send it to Tony or me, I think is probably the right thing. And we'll try to reach out. Thanks very much to Brad Whitmarsh and Siobhan Fanning, who are also our behind the scenes masterminds. And with that, welcome to Northeastern University School of Law and our 3rd annual CLIC conference. We hope the day is engaging.
Okay, so now we're going to kick off our first panel, Privacy, Incoherence in Medicine, the Confluence of Corporate Trade Secret, Government Non-Transparency, and AI-Mediated Erosion of Patient Privacy. My name is Brook Baker, and I'm a law professor here at Northeastern for a very long time, and last year's shared with a fellow position with the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity. I'll be moderating this panel that has an exciting collection of people on it, two academic activists, and then also two activists who've been working on particularly access to medicines for a very long time, both domestically and globally. And I'll introduce all 4 of them briefly in just a minute. This session came together out of my growing curiosity and concern about the deep contradictions that have arisen in the health arena. The growth and strengthening of legal protections for corporate and government secrecy, and the simultaneous erosion of patient privacy that is increasingly being mediated by artificial intelligence and commercial mining of patient information. It's as if the world is turned upside down. The biopharmaceutical industry now has legal protections that allow it to hide information that is vitally important to other scientists, to health providers, patients, payers, and competitors. And with respect to competitors, those are competitors who, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to be able to also produce these medicines and vaccines and diagnostics so that we can attack the pandemic with all the tools that are needed. It's not that we've never had legal protection for confidential business information, but the application, breadth, and impact of commercial secrecy in the health and biopharmaceutical context is breathtaking and frightening. Not only has government fostered and allowed non-transparency by corporations, it also too keeps much of its own health and pharmaceutical related information locked up, hidden from view, from policy review, from challenge, and from oversight. Back in the day, we felt that patient privacy was relatively secure. Kindly doctors were bound by a professional principle of patient confidentiality and legal privilege against disclosure concerning patients' medical conditions. Medical records were on paper and at least theoretically locked up in secure settings. But now patient information exists in the internet and Ethernet. It is collected, shared, mined, and I'm not sure I can say this correctly, algorithmized by medical professionals, health conglomerates, and commercial entities, often built with built-in biases and lack of privacy controls or limitations on use. So this panel, I hope, is going to help me unpack my confusion and consternation about these issues. The panelists will give relatively short presentations, and then we will open a dialogue between those of us who are gathered here in this Zoom world. I think since we do have a relatively small number, once we go to the discussion stage, we can do that simply by people visually raising your hand that you would like to speak, and then just go for it. And we'll certainly ask for participation from people other than the panelists, but we'd also like to encourage interaction between the panelists for reactions and questions to each other. So I'm going to introduce the panelists very briefly in the order they're going to speak. So Rebecca Lee, PhD, is Executive Director of Vivli, the Center for Global Clinical Research Data, and is on the faculty and works at the Center for Bioethics at the Harvard Medical School, where she serves as a co-director of research ethics program. She has 25 experience in industry and drug development processes. And she will talk about efforts in the US and elsewhere to increase clinical trial and FDA transparency. Petrie Maybarduk is a lawyer and directs the consumer organization Public Citizens Access to Medicine and Knowledge Economy Group. And he works with partners worldwide to make medicines affordable and secure the benefits of technology for all. Peter will talk about trade secrets and the impact of trade secrets on access to medicine, particularly germane now in the context of COVID-19 and the rise of our need for vaccines and biologics. James Love is the Director of Knowledge Ecology International. His training is in economics and finance, and he works on the production management and access to knowledge resources, as well as aspects of competition policy. Jamie helped me get my start in the access to medicine movement over 20 years ago. And so I owe a lot of my own professional development and activism to having worked with him for so many years. Sara Gerke is a research fellow in medicine, artificial intelligence, and the law at the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at the Harvard Law School. Her research focuses on the ethical and legal challenges of artificial intelligence and big data for healthcare and health law in the United States and Europe. Sara will talk about artificial intelligence, e-health, patient adherence, surveillance technology, patient privacy, and dignitary interest. I didn't say what Jamie would talk about. I should have. Jamie will talk about the broader issues of pharmaceutical industry transparency and the campaign to try to open up the information about R&D costs, medicine pricings, and perhaps if he has a chance and some time, he'll also talk about incentives for open science and collaborative research. So without further ado, let's kick it off with Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here. What I thought I would start with is a 90-second video which tells about our vision for reuse of clinical trial data. Maybe you or one of your loved ones has participated in a clinical trial. And so if you could cue up the video to show what our vision of this is for our nonprofit. Thank you.
Too many people around the world are suffering from disease. And every day, researchers are reminded of the urgent need to find cures. Researchers spend years running expensive clinical trials. Patients willingly give of themselves with the hope that taking part will lead to the next scientific discovery and insight. But when the trials are over, when their one question is answered, the raw data is often locked away, not used for future research. Participants in clinical trials deserve better. If we could reuse their data, we have the potential to speed up discoveries for diseases like dementia, diabetes, and cancer. That's where Vivli comes in. With Vivli, researchers around the world can search and combine data from different sources across thousands of clinical trials spanning multiple diseases. They can reuse data to ask new questions and uncover new clues. Our team is dedicated to making this process seamless, providing tools and support along the way. Vivli unlocks data's full potential by making sharing and reusing data easy. Let's put trial participants' precious contributions to better use and move faster toward treatments and cures that benefit us all. Get started today at vivli.org.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen and tell me if you can see my slides. Let me see. Can you see this in slideshow mode? Is this in slideshow mode?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So when I was working for the industry and then running trials for NIH, I never dreamed that we'd be sharing the patient level data. So that means at the participant level and not at the aggregate level. But when we started Vivli, which was just a project out of a center at Harvard that I was the executive director at, we realized how important it is to share participant level data. And that's really unlocking the participant level data at the row level so that we can combine data to answer important scientific questions. And why is that? Vivli is really big data in action using clinical trial data. So bringing together data from small biotechs, pharmaceutical companies, nonprofits and foundations, government like the NIH, academia, and then bringing that together because science really has no borders. We are able to answer questions in diseases like breast cancer, Alzheimer's, and then investigators can access that data, researchers, all for the good of patients. And why does that matter? What questions are currently being asked in Vivli? Let me tell you that. They're trying to reduce duplication of clinical trials. So when I was running clinical trials, it was hard for me to do that because I wasn't sure what the patient level data was for trials I was currently running. We can shape clinical trial design. So right now people are accessing data in Vivli to try to shape protocols that are currently in flight or they're currently designing. So that's what this data is being used for. To leverage patient contributions. Most trials today aren't successful, unfortunately. So that data just gets put on a shelf. So what we can do is we actually take the patient level data and they can reuse that data. So again, most trials are unsuccessful, But if we can leverage that data and use it again and again, that has a second or third life. But of course, as you know, we have to balance privacy versus transparency. So protecting participant privacy. We don't take any data that is not anonymized, but then we also have to maximize the value of that trial data that's collected to really respect the participants' contributions. And that is really important for us in Vivli. So right now we are the largest clinical trial data sharing platform. We have over 5,000 clinical trials that represents 3 million participants from over 100 countries. That represents 28 institutional members. We represent a number of pharmaceutical companies that have pledged their data, their trial data. That includes some of the largest pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, Lilly, Takeda, and others. Also biotechs such as Biogen, Regeneron, and others. And then we also have small foundations like Cure Duchenne. This also includes universities, Harvard, UCSF, Johns Hopkins, and then foundations as well for their clinical trials that they sponsor. This list is continuing to grow. So what does that mean? You can come in and search for trials and then access them. We also have what we call a Vivli COVID portal. Many of these institutional sponsors are actually running some of the most innovative COVID trials. So their COVID trials are also set in this COVID portal for access. And that provides a dedicated search function and a potential for fast-track review and sharing. And we've waived our fees to share, archive, and access COVID trials. Our partners have offered to waive anonymization fees, often a major barrier to sharing. Our business model is that people who request any of this data do not pay anything. Our institutional data contributors do pay a fee. So how this works is people search the Vivli platform for information about available studies. Then they request, our investigators request data sets. Each data request is reviewed according to contributors' publicly stated requirements. Then they access the data. So anyone who's interested in the data from Vivli would then access the data from approved requests. And then they access the data in a secure sandbox. You cannot just download it for the most part. And then analyze it using the robust statistical tools that we provide. Since data without the software to unlock it is not very useful. And then you can take out your analysis and then bring it all the way to publication. So we are a global platform that is agnostic to disease, funder, or data contributor. We have data with over many diseases, but this is, most of our data is in cancer, diabetes, hypertension, depression. That's not something that might be surprising. But our pillars of security is that we do insist on a DUA being signed. Microsoft is our technology partner. So we have the technology security around Microsoft Azure, and then we do insist on the data being anonymized. That is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions when that time comes. Thank you so much.
Brooke, you're on mute.
Thanks a lot for that introduction to the project on expanding access and collaboration with respect to clinical trial data. And now we'll go to Peter, who will talk about trade secrets and access to medicines.
Thanks, Brooke. I'm going to foremost address access problems with commercial confidential information, but I will also secondly touch a bit on some of these themes of patient and user privacy. So I run an access to medicines group at a consumer organization in Washington, D.C. Brooke and Jamie both trained me. And as many of you will know, historic concern for access to medicines has been price. Access to medicines is rationed all over the world due to high prices, including in the United States. But today we have a new top concern with the pandemic. It's not just about price, though that continues to be very important, but rather supply. and it's a problem intimately connected with today's discussion. No corporation manufactures at scale to supply the world when we're talking about diagnostics, treatments, or vaccines. And if you think through the consequences of that, we're also talking today about when we're going to have a safe and effective vaccine on the market, but vaccines are being, there's very limited doses available, and we could need something, depending on your calculation, something on the order of 14 billion doses, depending on how the science goes. We anticipate, if you, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, the Serum Institute, the head of that institute recently came out to say that it's going to take, on present capacity and present planning, probably 4 to 5 years for everyone in the world to have access to a safe and effective vaccine. Those of us in the United States will be at the front of the line. But imagine for a moment the economic devastation, not to mention the loss of life, potential cost of political stability for many parts of the world where populations are last in line and just waiting for the rest of us to be vaccinated before they receive access. The last 8 months have been completely devastating for American life. It's worth us sort of contemplating what that's going to be like for most of the world in places where the pandemic will last much longer and there aren't so many resources to mitigate the consequences. So we've been calling, you hear about vaccine nationalism. I'm calling it global vaccine apartheid, because there is going to be very strong division by race, by class, by country of origin as to who gets a vaccine and when they get through the pandemic. Now, it's not just about vaccines, and vaccines aren't going to be a magic bullet. Monoclonal antibodies and other forthcoming therapies can play a pretty important role in mitigating the effects of the pandemic, and those two look like they are going to be rationed in the extreme. Now, there are two paths basically to increase global access, and you can think of it as give a fish or teach a fish, if you like. There is a global effort to insist that wealthy countries and donors reserve some part of their supply to give to low and middle income countries through the World Health Organization, through Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance. And this is critically important. And of course, the Trump administration is not participating, and we'll need that to turn around in the next US administration quickly. It's also nowhere near enough because, of course, any US president is going to feel like we need to vaccinate the US population before we ship vaccines abroad. So the second path is essentially helping teach the world to make vaccines and treatments, technology transfer, and open manufacturing to increase the global supply. While only you or I can take any given dose of a vaccine, the underlying knowledge and information, of course, can be available to the world without depleting any of our enjoyment. We can bake a bigger pie rather than just talking about how to ration the pie. And that's where trade secrets come in. The information that the world needs to manufacture COVID treatments and vaccines across the world is tied up in a web of property rights and corporate secrecy. We will need, and I think Jamie Love may talk about a little bit more, the know-how, the manufacturing processes, the cell lines, all kinds of technology and knowledge that are not presently in the public domain. It's not just about patents. It's not even primarily about patents. It's trade secrets, and it's information that corporations claim and regulators allow to be considered commercial confidential. So we can't access it. The world can't access it. Generally, in the United States, you can't FOIA it. It's protected under one of the FOIA exemptions, confidential commercial information, that keeps us from accessing, under Freedom of Information laws, proper manufacturing data and things we can use to scale up manufacturing. So it means that we can't use, under present conditions, the world's available manufacturing capacity to make more vaccines and treatments. Rather, only the arrangements to which corporations agree. And perhaps even more importantly, that discourages new investments in rapid manufacturing capacity. So it's kind of mind-blowing to stop and think about it, but it means that countries, health authorities around the world aren't really managing their own pandemic response. They're just negotiating with pharmaceutical companies or waiting to be told what to do and accepting the conditions that are laid down to maximize profits under monopoly circumstances. So it's a travesty, and we need the information out. It's mostly a political project. We need the will. The role of the US government is critical. The World Health Organization has a program that Jamie and Brook have been involved in to share technology with the world called CTAP, Technology Access Pool for COVID-19. And we're really going to need the next US government to look at these matters differently than the current one has. But in addition to being a political project, for purposes of this audience, it's also a legal project. If we can move the government, what then? What authorities does the government use to access, provide, license, share that know-how and data? And there are some interesting, outstanding questions around that. For publicly funded technologies, we can contract, we can write conditions into the contracts. FDA may be able to disclose more regulatory data than it does, but there may be limits in the case law, absent new legislation. And some students working with the Global Health Justice Project at Yale proposed some interesting reforms. Maybe we need a fair use doctrine for trade secrets. We should have more of a balancing test and assert the public interest more strongly in balancing tests about what information is disclosed. For example, in FOIA cases where you're balancing the right to commercial confidential information versus the public interest, making that information available to manufacture for the world. And perhaps we can broadly use eminent domain. So these are sort of questions that I think it would be useful to develop more of an academic consensus around the legal authorities, put this information in public domain. Now, briefly, and hopefully I've sort of underscored that connection sufficiently, I wanted to touch on 3 additional consumer interests that back up Brook's thesis that we're seeing an entrenchment of corporate privilege while we are sort of reducing patient and user privacy. And I won't go too deep because I think it speaks respectively to Rebecca and Jamie and Sarah's expertise. But for clinical trials, an additional interest is that independent researchers need to be able to look at disclosed data and studies in order to assess further risks. And when researchers have been able to do this, they have saved a great many lives. So Avandia was estimated to have caused thousands of heart attacks. Independent researchers looked at the data and it was pulled from the market. Tamiflu was shown to be no more effective than aspirin. Drug companies are actually required to share surprisingly little data, and what they are required to share is, generally speaking, to the regulators, not to the public, at least in the United States. The European Union is somewhat ahead of us in this regard. So clinical trial disclosure for our ability to assess safety and efficacy. Another interest is simply in drug pricing. Jamie may speak to this. But across the country, one of the primary lines of attack against high drug prices has been transparency rules. So state legislators are working to pass laws that require transparency and disclosure of drug prices. The primary counterattack from drug companies has been trade secrets, has been saying the prices are actually our proprietary data. How we price this is up to us. You don't get to know. And there's litigation in that regard. And finally, on digital rights, not an access to medicines interest, strictly speaking, but it's something that we are working on. We are seeing, so big tech, of course, as it concentrates its power, is using a variety of tools to strip us of our privacy. In trade agreements, we are seeing companies asserting their rights to pass information across borders over the right of countries to pass privacy legislation. They're inverting the European Union's paradigm that privacy is a fundamental right and commerce needs to adjust. And the trade agreements generally say commerce is a fundamental right and privacy rules need to adjust. And that's going to be an ongoing attack in recent years. Also, in the context of COVID, workplace surveillance is increasing. So we put out a report, which I'll drop in the chat later. More than 50 new apps have been released since the pandemic began that are being used by at least 340,000 workers at 32 workplaces to track employee activity, pass that information on to employers, often without going through the employees. The default setting is essentially mass surveillance by design. And it's a tough issue because, of course, we want track and trace and we want to be able to deal with the pandemic with appropriate technology. But in many cases, there isn't much privacy review of the technologies that are going out. So I think in summation, I strongly agree with Brook that we have greater secrecy protection for companies and less for people, and the rules and legal rules that have developed and aggressive exploitation of those rules by companies on commercial confidential information and on trade secrets is a major challenge, and the consequences are going to hurt a lot of people. But for us, the top issue right now is we actually need commercial confidential information to be liberated to the public so that we can respond to the pandemic, so that we can manufacture vaccines for the world. It's just something we have to overcome. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Peter. And you really have, I think, helped set up Jamie, who's going to talk next. And I think Jamie's going to talk, about the congruence of government and corporate privacy both, and the various campaigns that he's been engaged in with allies to try to get access to some of the most important information, including on research and development costs. So Jamie, take it away.
Thank you, Professor Baker. I was in preparing for this. I tried to stick to the title, the topics mentioned in the title. So I'm going to hit several things, primarily just to explain what we think are good ideas. So I don't spend a lot of time developing the foundation why it's important, but get more to what our proposed reforms that we would support, or that others that we work with support. First, I just want to mention briefly on the patient privacy side, which is an important theme of this meeting. Now, one of our board members is Professor Tim Hubbard in the UK, and he works a lot with genomic information. And one of the big challenges they have, one of the biggest challenges they've had, is how do you deal with the patient privacy issue? As the first speaker mentioned, the more you identify characteristics of the patient, the more impossible it is to maintain the privacy and anonymity of that person. So there's practical limits to how much information you can give out about a patient in a database before you can figure out the exact name of the patient at some point. And so the position that they've taken in the UK, and I believe what Rebecca was talking in her project, which is what we think is the way forward, was that the data are basically managed by these third parties, which provide researchers access to the data under a certain set of conditions in terms of how they're going to, and they have a stewardship responsibility to the data, so that you can have deeper access in terms of the metadata about the individual patients, but you're not just putting it on the web for everyone. You sort of come in, you post a research question, you're allowed to sort of mine the data in a limited way. And actually the queries in some of these things are done by the third party as opposed to the individual researcher themselves. So I think that's important. Another thing I wanted to mention, which comes up in the AI discussions in big data, is that AI, artificial intelligence, and a lot of the work that's being right down and looking at patient records and mining patient records is, big is better, and scale is important, and that can lead to concentration. And so we think that's important that you look at these databases as essential facilities. And also you may want to have, in a lot of cases, nonprofit entities actually being the repositories or controlling most of the data, so that you don't have a situation like you see in search engines right now, where Google essentially dominant because nobody really can match the kind of databases that they have. In terms of the trade secret thing that Peter talked about, I'm going to share. I think I just shared a picture of something on the chat thing, which describes the obligations that we think government should place on people that register drugs, that would make it easier to have more competition, faster competition, more robust supply, and safer biosimilars. And what we're saying is it just be a matter of policy that biologic drugs, for example, should not be this sort of permanent monopolies, or there should be all these mysteries about how you manufacture them. And if you're a patient that's asked to use a biosimilar, you should have more confidence that the biosimilar is in fact really similar to the brand name drug or the originator product. And right now that's not happening. Peter touched on several of the reasons for this, but fundamentally it comes to the idea that we tolerate deep secrecy. In the United States, on the patent landscape for biologic drugs is considered a secret. You have to, in the Biologics Competition Law, in the Obamacare Act, in the Affordable Care Act, you actually have to sign non-disclosure agreements to get a list of patents that are related to a biologic drug, and refuse to share the information broadly, even within your own firm, under the provisions of the biologics law in the United States. So even the patent landscapes are treated as some kind of proprietary information, even though supposedly one of the reasons for patents is to provide more disclosure. On the transparency front with the government, I mean, one of the concerns that we've had has been that the government itself is in a position to share a lot more information about all sorts of things, on know-how, on clinical trial outcomes for trials that they conduct, on the licenses, on the cost of conducting clinical trials, and things like that. But the policies by U.S. agencies, and I think it's also true in other governments, has been really depressing. For example, when we asked, when the U.S. government will put out like a request to license a proprietary, a set of inventions they have on a biologic drug, for example, and possibly to treat cancer or HIV or something else. In some cases, they'll propose a license to a company that has no web page. And there's like nothing really known about them. They have no FCC filings. And so we'll contact the NIH and we'll say, can you tell us something about the firm? In one case, we ask, we have no address for the firm. We don't know where the firm is even located. And they'll identify the state, like California or something like that. And they will say, that's proprietary information. They would treat the address and telephone number of an applicant for a monopoly on a government-funded technology, which may be worth billions of dollars, as confidential business information. If we'd ask them, are there any former employees of the NIH working for this mystery firm? That's considered confidential information. If we ask them who's on the board of directors, that's confidential information. If we ask, are you negotiating with the license a waiver of U.S. manufacturing responsibilities, they'd say that's confidential information. If we'd say, if we'd say, is there any foreign ownership? That's confidential information. I'm not making this up. These are the actual conversations we have. We comment probably in about 12 licenses every year for the past 4 years. And we've done over 50 licenses so far. And we always ask these questions and we get these ridiculous responses back. There was a case when the NIH was licensing to Gilead cancer treatment, a CAR T treatment, and they'd already licensed a very similar set of patents to a company called CLIC, which was acquired by Gilead. And Gilead paid like $12 billion for this startup company. And they wanted to license something kind of in the neighborhood for a blood cancer to CLIC again. And the government had already conducted a clinical trial of 77 patients, which was roughly the same number of patients that these companies had used to get these particular kind of cell therapies approved by the FDA in the past. And we asked the NIH, how much did the government spend on that clinical trial? Because we thought that was relevant under the law to the incentive that was necessary for other companies to bring cell therapies to the market. If one of the issues they say is it's really expensive to do things, and we want to know, okay, we believe it's expensive, but we're kind of interested in how expensive. We'd like to know the actual numbers. And since the government had conducted a trial, in this case, in Bethesda on its own campus, and the NIH refused to give us the information. They said that they didn't know what the trial cost and that they don't keep track of those things. It's sort of the theory the NIH had was trying to get us to sort of buy into is the idea that they could authorize a multi-year clinical trial that would cost millions of dollars without anyone knowing what the actual, total cost was going to be. And so now we're in court trying to get documents, just keep track of how they calculate, how they manage their budgets on these things. When we ask for, well, I could go on and on, but I would have to say the problems we've had with the NIH emulate out of the director's office, and things have gotten worse under Francis Collins than they were under his predecessors in the Bush administration and under the Clinton administration. It's been a steady, and I've been around a long time in this area, and I can sort of see the trends, and it's not been good on the transparency side as far as the NIH is concerned. I want to mention one more thing on trial data in terms of patients. And that is that when they're first beginning to look in the 90s on this debate about how records are going to be handled in terms of the patient records, we had thought at the time that the rule should be that there should be sufficient amount of interoperability of patient records that you should be able to identify who is going to be the custodian of your records. And you could negotiate with your own manager of your records, whatever preferences you had on privacy, access, and whatever interface you felt was most useful for you. This didn't really happen, but I can tell you in my own case, I have a hard time keeping track of what vaccinations I've had for, it's like for yellow fever and different things that I might want to kind of recall, even when I've had certain medical procedures being done, because, over the long arc of history. And I've had practices that I've been involved in, our family members are involved, that have gone out of business or have been merged by another company. They've just disappeared. And then, your access to the records is sort of, really becomes challenging at that point. So for a variety of reasons, we thought that the idea of empowering the patient to choose the company that managed their records and having some separation, structural separation between the companies that manage records for patients and people that provide access to records for medical researchers or doctors' offices should be the direction we should go on electronic records. We also, I think, are on the issue of privacy. I'm at the end of my talk right now. I'll wind it up right now. I want to don't want to be too abusive on the time. And that is that we are, I personally am open to the idea that there'd be some areas where you have to share data. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a policy by the government to do a better job of protecting people's privacy as it relates particularly to their employment opportunities insurance. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Jamie, and we'll probably in the open discussion get to cover some of the other multitude of topics that you have your finger in. So let's hear from Sara, and I think this will focus quite a bit as well on patient privacy interests, particularly in the context of the growth of artificial intelligence.
Perfect, thanks so much. First, I just need the host disabled my screen sharing, so that would be great if I can share my slides.
If you would want to try again, I think I just made you a co-host.
Oh, perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, you should be able now to see my slides, I hope.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so today I just want to give you like a quick overview of some of the promises and perils of artificial intelligence and digital health. So I will first talk about the promises and then about the perils of AI and digital health. So AI and digital health have enormous potential to transform healthcare for the better. And I will give you a couple of examples to show their promises. So AIs are already in clinical use in the US, and over 60 health AI-based medical devices have been cleared or approved by the FDA. So far, and in particular, AI shows great promise in the areas of medical imaging and diagnostics. And so, for example, here you can see IDXDR, which is the first FDA authorized AI diagnostic system that provides an autonomous screening decision for the eye disease diabetic retinopathy without the need for a clinician to also interpret the image or results, which makes it really usable by healthcare providers who may not normally be involved in eye care. Then for better control of the spread of COVID-19, exposure notification apps have been implemented in several countries, such as Singapore, Germany, and Australia. And Apple and Google also launched their exposure notification system, which enables public health authorities to create apps and identify with the help of Bluetooth technology potential exposures to COVID-19 and alert the exposed user to further instructions. And exposure notification apps rapidly notify users once they have had a close exposure to someone diagnosed with COVID-19 and prompts the user to self-quarantine or in other cases obtain testing. In the US right now, 11 states are currently offering exposure notification apps based on Apple's and Google's systems, such as Virginia, New York, and New Jersey. And many more states, such as Connecticut, have announced plans to release such apps in the near future. Then ingestible electronic sensors, sometimes also referred as smart pills, are promising technology for improving health outcomes that may, for example, be useful in monitoring and promoting the taking of medication. So an ingestible electronic sensor is usually either co-ingested with medicine or taken as an embedded part of a drug. And once ingested into the human body, it can communicate with a wearable sensor capable of detecting and recording data, such as time of medication intake, behavioral and physiological metrics. And the wearable sensor then forwards the collected information to a compatible computing device, such as a smartphone or a tablet computer, which then processes and displays the data. And the display function can also be connected with a cloud database that enables data sharing, such as to family members or physicians. And so here, for example, you can see Abilify My Sight, which is a combination product of Potio's ingestible electronic sensor and Otsuka's Abilify, which is aripiprazole. That's a drug that is used to treat adults for schizophrenia, bipolar I disorder, and major depressive disorder. And in this product, the drug is embedded with Potio's ingestible electronic sensor, and the hope is it will improve medication adherence. Telehealth. So we also currently see a boom in telehealth services during the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially, there were only few formal large-scale mechanisms for the reimbursement of digital health solutions in the US. However, recent developments, including COVID-19, have really led to increased coverage of other digital provided services, such as the use of telehealth. So let us now shift to the perils of AI in digital health. So as we have seen, AI in digital health hold great potential to transform healthcare for the better, but at the same time, there are also perils associated with them, and 4 of which I'm going to discuss in the following. So first, in the context of health AI, one major peril is bias, yeah? So there are different types of biases, and sometimes they also overlap, and I'm going to show you 4 relevant types of biases that exist with health AI. So first, the slogan garbage in, garbage out applies to health AI. So the better the training data is, the better the AI will perform. So if health AIs are trained on biased data, existing disparities in health may be augmented rather than reduced. And so, for example, the scenario could be that an African-American patient's acrolentigenous melanoma, so this is the most common type of melanoma in individuals with darker skin, is missed because a physician trusts a health AI cancer screening device that was primarily trained on white skin. And so it's really essential to diversify data to reflect different populations adequately to ensure fairness. Second, it can also be the case that the used algorithm exhibits bias. So for example, a recent study by Obermeyer et al. Has shown a substantial racial bias against Black patients in a predictive algorithm used by many hospitals and other healthcare systems to identify and help patients with complex health needs. And then third, there's also a further risk of contextual bias in cases where health AIs are designed in high-income countries like the US for low and middle-income countries. So for example, in a top-ranked specialist clinic, it might be best to recommend to a patient a complex surgery that requires an expert team to manage potentially deadly side effects. However, such a recommendation is likely to kill rather than save the patient in a rural hospital in a low resource setting. So contextual bias will be even far more nuanced in most cases. And then we need to find, we can have also a bias that is unconscious. So for example, when data scientists choose which parameters to use to help the program learn, they often unconsciously include their own beliefs and values in the code. And so it's crucial to have a diverse team in place when developing health AIs to reduce such biases. And so the goal really should be ethics by design rather than after a product has been designed and tested. So stakeholders should try as early as possible in the development process of their products to mitigate biases. So second, in the world of big data, it's really also of pivotal importance that we adequately protect the privacy of individuals, especially patients. And so in the US, we have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and HIPAA's privacy rule is really the key federal law to protect health data privacy. However, HIPAA has significant gaps when it comes to today's healthcare environment, since it only covers protected health information generated by covered entities or their business associates. So protected health information is in generally individually identifiable health information. And HIPAA covered entities include health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and also most healthcare providers. And a business associate is a person or entity that performs certain functions or activities on behalf of or provides services to a covered entity that involves the use or disclosure of protected health information. And so the problem is that HIPAA does not cover health information generated by entities not covered by HIPAA. And so in particular, much of the health information collected by technology giants such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, etc., that are all investing heavily in the field of AI are usually not covered entities and will fall outside of HIPAA. And so large amounts of data, health data, are collected from patients, not just in clinical settings, but also in daily life, such as through health apps, Fitbits, and other wearables. And this data may then be used to develop health AIs or other digital health technologies, and patient privacy may be compromised in the process, since the tech companies can frequently share personal data for research and commercial purposes without being subject to HIPAA's obligation. To give you another example in the light of the current pandemic, so much of the data generated by AI surveillance programs will not be covered under HIPAA in the first place and may lack protection entirely. So for example, cell phone geolocation data do not fall under HIPAA, but are sensitive data that now reveals information about one's COVID-19 risk. And so while HIPAA, which is important to know, while HIPAA preempts less protective state law, it does not preempt states whose laws are more protective. And so, for example, California recently has taken action at the state level, and the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018 became effective on January 1st this year and grants really various rights to California residents with regard to personal information that is held by businesses. However, the problem is that the CCPA only applies to California residents. And so individuals currently really depend in the US on the privacy laws of each state to what extent their privacy is protected. Third, so trust will be undermined, if health AI and digital health technologies are not implemented ethically, safely, and also improve patient outcome. So for example, the recommendations of opaque, so-called black box models raise specific concerns. And it will be really a challenge to determine how transparency, which creates trust, can be achieved in this context. But perhaps there is no need to open the black box. So it may be that at least in some cases, positive results from randomized clinical trials or other forms of testing will serve as sufficient demonstration of the safety and effectiveness of such health AIs. So for example, clinicians prescribed aspirin for about 70 years without understanding the mechanism by which the drug works, but they knew that it works. And in the context of smart pills, for example, much more work also needs to be done to enhance public trust so that such products will be broadly accepted by society and markets. So for example, Proteus, the company I mentioned earlier that makes the sensors that can be embedded in pills to track medication adherence. So they filed bankruptcy in June. And the company, which was once valued $1.5 billion US, was just acquired in August by Otsuka for only $15 million. So the combination product, Abilify My Site, has really never gained the popularity Potios would have wished for, and its sensors also did not fit neatly into the clinical workflow. And then fourth, another peril of AI in digital health is limited access. So for example, developers should consider the racial disparities that surround access to these technologies among vulnerable population who may be most in need of these products. So for example, exposure notification apps, smart pills, and telehealth all require that one has the necessary technology, such as smartphone or a home computer with a high-speed internet connection. However, a significant number of Medicare patients, for example, 1 in 4 beneficiaries do not have access to such technology, which is 50 million people in the US. And so I conclude that much more work and thinking is required to deliver the promises of health AI and digital health, and stakeholders such as AI companies, hospitals, and physicians can really positively shape the field of health AI and digital health in general by practicing ethics by design. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I'd like to thank all 4 panelists for just a tremendous introduction to this subject area. And I learned a lot listening, and I'm sure that the other participants did as well. We do have a small group of people in the room with us. So maybe we could see if people have questions. I have some questions myself, but I'd rather hear from people also in the room. And also if the panelists have any questions or comments back to each other, because there were a lot of overlap in what some people were saying, and it might be useful to hear reactions of the panelists to each other's presentation. So I'm just gonna sit here and look for hands raised in the participant chat or physical hands raised on the screen. I see Jessica first.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that really informative set of talks. So I have 2 questions for anybody really, but maybe mostly for Peter and Jamie. The first one just has to do with the federalization of trade secret law and the trends to federalization and how you see that affecting the underlying problems that you're describing. For the students that are here, I think understanding that move is going to be important. And then the second question has to do with, for those of us who are not experts in this particular field, we're reading headlines about how the science around COVID is super collaborative and people are opening up their data and sharing clinical trial information. I mean, the news is very optimistic about scientific and pharmaceutical behavior that is sort of against the strict rules of not sharing in IP. And so what I want to ask about that popular representation versus the concerns that all you are describing is what more to read into that, and you know, how to understand those headlines in light of you know, in light of the argument that you need the IP to get the work done, but it turns out that like massive global collaboration might be getting the work done faster. So I'm just trying to ask for a expert explanation of the context of the headlines versus the challenges that you're describing given the COVID pandemic.
One other raised hand from Andy Sellers. Maybe we could take that question too, and then look to some answers.
Sure, and I guess my question might be for maybe especially Rebecca or Jamie, but it could be for everybody. First of all, to introduce myself, I'm Andy Sellers. I'm the director of the Technology Law Clinic at Boston University School of Law, just down the road. And I was curious to know, I heard from a few folks, and I think especially Rebecca, about some tensions between having individualized data for either research subjects or patients for research, and then the need to share a lot of this data in an anonymized way. I'm aware from some of my colleagues who work in computer science of some techniques that might allow you to have a little bit of both, techniques like differential privacy, where you structurally randomize that in certain ways, or multi-party computation, where you don't expose the whole data set to everybody, but everyone shares just enough to do specific computations. And I'm just curious from an industry perspective, maybe, are these helpful? Do these work, or is it just too complicated and what you really need is the data in a rawer form?
Okay, so let's get responses from our panelists.
Jamie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. First, on Andy's question. I think that what Tim's work is focused on, and I'm very sympathetic to this, is that there's a benefit of having not-for-profit, independent repositories that control access to big data, that can work with researchers under there's a gated access, and as I think you described pretty well, just not randomly mining the data any way they want, but coming in with a research question, then having the queries actually be done by third parties on their behalf. And the trust is so important on this because I used to live next to a woman that worked for a medical records company, and I don't know if she got fired, but she got in a lot of trouble because she was accessing records of one of her family members that she shouldn't have had access to. And I think if you look at what's happening with big data, there are a lot of, or the Cambridge Analytica story or something like that. I mean, it's a fragile thing when you assemble that much data. You have to really take it seriously in terms of your stewardship responsibilities, and it has to have a certain amount of transparency of governance. And so it is not an easy thing to manage, but I think the benefits on the medical side are so important for science. The other thing I'd have to say is that the way clinical trials are financed right now is a huge problem, and that is the sense that we expect companies to make a lot of money off of a clinical when they, if they invest in a clinical trial, if you spend $30 million or $100 million in a clinical trial, you're supposed to get it back by having a monopoly and things like that. The companies that are then designing those trials and expecting to have a monopoly in their product, they design the trials in such a way which are not as informative as they should be, and they don't have really the right incentives to share negative results and other things that would benefit researchers. And so to get better design and better sharing of data and better reporting of negative results and things like that, you really have to have the government do more of the trials themselves. But that's not just a US issue, because the US is not the whole planet. We're only about a quarter of world GDP or less than that. So you really have to start moving toward agreements with Germany, Canada, UK, France, China, other companies to help sort of pay the cost of conducting trials. Unfortunately, efforts to push those kind of collaborations on international funding through the World Health Organization have been blocked by the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the United States, Germany, and some other big countries and the direct companies. So we think there has to be some rethinking about how do you finance some critical parts of the research and development process and what the incentive structures look like. Brook mentioned earlier that we did a lot of work trying to de-link the incentive for investments. So he has to recalibrate the role of the governments in funding research directly, or redesign the incentives so they're different, including incentives to share data. But I could talk for, as Brook knows, way too long on this topic. So
yeah, so maybe we can have Rebecca take up the second question, and then Peter can address the Jessica's questions, and I might actually have a little response to Jessica as well.
So the question around novel techniques like differential privacy, we've really looked into this. Right now our data is accessed in a secure sandbox, and that is quite limiting actually. So we've looked into those techniques, as well as providing synthetic versions of data. And that is something that we are looking hard at, particularly for rare disease data. We have a lot of people trying to share rare disease data, and it's really very difficult, if not impossible, to anonymize. And so that's really the next step. And I think differential privacy is is difficult for a number of reasons. So I think the next step for us would be to provide synthetic data sets for rare disease data. And I think that will become a reality in the next year for us. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
On the federalization of trade secrets thing, so my recollection on this, we didn't end up getting too involved in the fight. I think mostly because it was a hard fight to win. We don't like it, but I think it's almost a political complaint more than a substantive legal complaint. My recollection is the Trade Secret Protection Act doesn't really change the substantive law that the states have been imposing, or sort of the restatement, but it does introduce federal penalties. So you have additional disincentives to disclosure. And we just feel that there is not an adequate public interest balance in trade secret law right now. And so doubling down on that and federalizing it without thinking through the protections is a problem. So that's not the most sophisticated legal answer, but I think just sort of speaks to Brook's thesis that we are way, way behind in defending the public interest, while lobbies are pretty advanced in moving their interests through new protections in law. And I'm trying to recall the second question. Maybe Brook should pick it up.
Yeah, so on the second, and just on this one, I mean, I think people may well be aware that there's been an increased effort in trade agreements, free trade agreements, to establish global norms for trade secret protection. And again, this is a push by industry, it will have consequences, of course, both to protect secrecy, but also reduce government regulation, because there'll be a question of what information government can also access, and how closed corporate information is, even to public oversight.
Yeah, criminal measures against regulators, right? If regulators disclose data, no, seriously, I mean, there's sort of like this pursuit to make it clear that to countries around the world that you best not disclose what we tell you not to disclose.
So on the collaboration, I mean, there was certainly a lot of scientific sharing. There's open publication, publication before peer review. There was the disclosure of the genome very quickly, which led to the rapid ability to develop tests, et cetera. But frankly, as soon as things began to be of commercial interest, things closed down, compartmentalized, and became more secret. There is some limited forms of cooperation on clinical trials, but frankly, the design of clinical trials has been terrible. We don't really have a good system of comparative trials set up. We don't have trials with sufficient size and sophistication to give us the answers we need. As soon as commercial interest came into play, we saw the return to secrecy and kind of going it alone and trying to get to the line fast. So we have poorly organized clinical trials. We have speed up of regulatory processes, and then we get into the problems that Peter mentioned in the pandemic, which is we're going to have inadequate supply and overly high prices. And so we've done virtually everything wrong, almost, in terms of non-cooperation since we initially shared the genome, and beyond that, it's pretty much been business as usual. So I think Woody has his hand up.
Sorry, can I because there is another good answer to this one, is there was a good New York Times story the other day on the unified vaccine protocol that was overlooked in order to, so at the beginning of the pandemic, there was brief consideration of whether all the companies should have to compare apples to apples and the data be assessed together instead of fragmenting the trials. And we went the other way, the world went the other way, just out of deference to the companies, which leads to inferior data about vaccines.
Brook has described a problem in trade agreements, and there's this one particular provision in trade agreements where governments are restricted on their ability to force source code for software to be open. That's an example of that's something done in trade agreements before it ever appeared in any national law. Actually, I mean, it was unfortunate at the time. There's a strong lobby on privacy. I'm sort of corporate privacy, or trade secrets, confidential business information. I think the best way to counter it is to have more of a global movement on transparency, and And in doing that, I think you have to address the economics that are the basis of the confidentiality claims. I think you have to be willing to concede in some areas that there is a legitimate interest in confidentiality if that's the only way you can monetize the cost of the investment of doing certain things. And that society has to think about business models that are consistent with transparency and put those things on the table. So I think that building up a movement on transparency is really going to be important, and addressing the economics basis of the rationale for secrecy is also important.
Okay, Woody.
Thank you all for a really great panel. I really appreciate you being here. And I had a question. My research is about privacy and technology. So the discussion around things like proximity notification apps was really interesting to me. And thinking about the disease surveillance and public health surveillance generally, I wonder if some of you can, there are two things that I just haven't figured out yet. And I wonder if I could ask you as public health experts, your take on this. What's the proper scope of a policy or regulatory intervention with response to COVID and disease surveillance? So a couple of things have been introduced. Sara talked about how HIPAA was limited. Do we need to sort of make some surgical interventions to help get the information we need for meaningful public health or disease surveillance? Or is the problem something in your mind larger than that, that requires a much more fundamental shift away? Because even if we were to get people to use the proximity notification apps, how much is that really going to help us? And given the state of people's concerns about privacy, do you sense something more meaningful that needs to be done? And then that leads me to the second question, which is, in the public health community, is there any concern about, at least in the privacy community, what a lot of people talk about, which is surveillance inertia? The idea that in an attempt to get as much information as possible for a meaningful public health response, then how do we ensure that those systems stay either limited and used for the purpose for which they were created, and we don't have mission creep into other things, or have some at least sense of whether the infrastructure that we're laying now is going to be necessary in the future? So any wisdom? I know those are really big questions, but they're things that I can't stop thinking about with respect to disease surveillance generally and the COVID in the pandemic.
Perhaps I try to answer a couple, perhaps saying a little bit about it. So, so first, when it comes to COVID-19, we have anyway, it's in the public interest, so we have anyway more loosely, it's easier to share data anyway. In the EU, the GDPR has exceptions, so you can share because of the public interest, and the same is with HIPAA too. So so that's like a different scenario, but like usually, and you also asked with the exposure notification apps. I mean, we don't know if they will work at the end. We need to have more research, and we need to have more people who are using it. And then in the US, you also have no national approach. It's a state approach. So you need to make sure that they are the interoperability, that they are talking to each other. I mean, they are working on this. I think the app from New Jersey and New York, they are now starting to being able to be connected. But I think, I mean, these are all just, we are still, we do not know whether this works. We will see that in the long term, if that was something which was useful to implement.
Brooke, we have to finish up.
Well, we have to go, do we have our 10 minutes in the?
Oh, yeah. So I'm just going to say that I have to leave because I have to go to the next panel, which starts at 10:30. But of course, this is a breakout room for people who want to stay and chat, and for those who want to join the next conversation that starts at 10:30 in Zoom room B. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah.